super, very, very grateful that you and your elders have allowed me this opportunity to be with you. Yes, we grew up back when y'all were down in Mount Carmel. We were up on the hill just ahead of them. Back when Mount Carmel was just a cornfield. I feel really old saying that, but we have been really loving being back in town. We really have. We were in Nashville, as you mentioned, in Brentwood at Concord Road Church of Christ for almost 11 years. And it was a great time in youth ministry, and I really just loved it so much. I loved my time there, but there was just such an opportunity here. And with Melissa's dad passing away and both of our moms being here by themselves, we thought we cannot pass up this opportunity when Owens Crossroads gave us a call. And so we have been here a little over a year. I think it's been 1 year and 2 weeks at this point that we have been back in town and just loving the family over there. Tonight, as we talk about Make Me a Servant Like Jesus, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. We're going to have to start, though, with the beginning of why we even need this whole idea of being a servant at all. Why does that even matter? And the key is, and we all know it, is that abuse of politics and power has been a problem for all of time, right? That has always been a thing. It's always been a problem. It's always going to be a problem. And that's going to affect every area of our faith or of our lives, including our faith. We're going to see that. We see that when we go and we see politicians get in trouble. We see that when we see church leaders get in trouble. And we see it when we see CEOs and people of power abusing that power and getting in trouble. And just like every area of our lives, though, the key is whether we're at the top of a company or whether we're just a normal everyday person, there's this huge temptation for each of us. And that temptation for us is to feel like our opinions are better than everybody else's. And to feel like the way we think things should be done are the only way that things should be done. That we deserve special treatment, that our time is more important than everybody else's time, right? And so all these little things creep into our day. And they creep into our lives where eventually we have this whole idea that we're just better than people. That for some reason people owe us something, people that don't even know us. And we have this whole thing pouring down, and that's the culture that we live in. And that's kind of where we're stuck today. And we see these little fights for power in every organization. We see it in our families. We see it in our churches. We see it in companies. We see it in politics. And we see it all around, but it all boils down to that. And an example I found of this, and I have to be honest, I feel like this is a preacher story, okay? I could not find any facts on this, but I'm going to give it to you, okay? Anyway, there's an example of this of a church in Dallas that split. And it was a very, very messy split. One side, the side that was trying to break off, decided to sue the side that owned the building and the property for the rights to the property. And so as they were going through the split, they tried to take it to court, and the judge said, I'm not going to see this case. You can take it to your denominational board or convention. You can let them decide. Well, the denominational board decided to go with the defecting group, and they granted them the property to the building and to the land and everything. And so, of course, the people who were there originally decided to pack up and leave and start a new congregation. And there was just this big, big mess. And after a little bit of time passed, it eventually came out what caused that split. This is why I don't know if this is real or not, but stick with me. They said it's because at a potluck meal, an elder was served a smaller piece of ham than the child next to him in line. And so that started this whole domino effect where you've got people leaving and churches splitting. And you can imagine if this story is true, the people of Dallas had a good laugh at this when it made its way to the newspaper and everyone had it. But the truth of the matter is, that kind of thing, we can imagine it happening. Now, just for the record, I don't know any preacher, I don't know any elder, or really any deacon who would cause a big split over a piece of ham. I think most of us, if we were in line, there was a kid beside us, we would even volunteer, I would hope, the bigger piece to the child next to us. But if this story's true, you can imagine the type of feelings that were going through this group. I know it's extreme, but things like this happen all the time. On a smaller scale, we see people get their feelings hurt so often. How often do we think that the paint color that we think the auditorium or the hallway should be, or the color of the carpet, whatever color we think it should be, is much better than anybody else's color that they think the carpet should be? It happens. I've heard arguments about it. I've only been in ministry 12 years, but I've heard arguments about that. How often do we think that the topic that we want to hear talked about in Bible class, or the curriculum set that we want to use in Bible class, how often do we think our choice is better than everybody else's choice? And so we have problems, and we see these little power struggles come up. And it just continues to go on in this cycle where we start to feel like we are somehow better than all the other people and that our opinions matter and that for some reason we should be taken care of more than anyone else. But that's really not a new problem at all if we think about it. Unfortunately, this fight for power and prestige and honor and control runs all through our lives. So the first biblical example I want to look at comes from the book of Esther. And so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and start opening up to your Old Testament. We're going to kind of skim a little bit, and then we're going to pick up at the end of the book of Esther here in just a minute. Because in Esther, we get this really great example of power out of control. That's kind of what we get to see. And it's going on. We have the whole, the main plot of Esther going on, but really the subplot and the whole idea behind where the whole problem is coming from in Esther is really what I want to talk about. If we look back at the story of Esther, we see there's really two guys we're going to talk about when we talk about. We've got Haman, and if I was talking to Tilly, because I have to explain these things to her, Haman's he's the bad guy here, okay? And we've got Mordecai, and Mordecai's the good guy, okay? And so we've got Haman, the bad guy, and Mordecai, the good guy. And we're going to see Haman, the bad guy, essentially self-destruct because of pride. Don't worry, we're going to get to being a servant, but first you have to realize this whole idea of pride as well. And so if we're flipping through and we're looking like in Esther chapter 3, Haman gets this big promotion. He's feeling really good about himself, and he's a really popular guy. And as he's going out, everyone's bowing down to him because he's such a popular person at this point. But there's one guy who won't do it, this Jew named Mordecai. He won't bow down to Haman. He just won't do it. And that eats at him. Here's a guy, everybody else is bowing down, but one guy won't do it. He eats away at Haman so bad that he says, I've got to destroy all their people. And that's kind of where the whole thing kind of drums up in the story of Esther, right? Where all these people have to be destroyed. All the Jews have to be destroyed because he just can't take it when this one guy won't bow down to him, and he feels that important. And so they decide to wipe all the Jews out of the country. Well, as the rest of the story continues to play out with Esther, we see Haman's pride just continue to build and grow and bubble and just get out of control again. By the time we get to chapter 5, as we're looking around, Esther's trying to figure out what to do to save her people, the Jews, which she is one of, right? And as Queen Esther has this whole plot that she thinks up, and she has the king, and she says, look, here's what I want. She puts on all her nice clothes, and we see all the whole, everything play out, and she goes, I have a request for the king, and it's that the king and Haman come to dinner. Let me just throw you a party, right? And so, cool, well, that's great. So that's the request. They go to this party. You got to think about Haman for just a minute here. Here's a guy who's already has his pride just blowing up and bubbling up with everything. And now he has a personal invitation to have dinner with the king and queen. King, queen, him. He is so excited about that, right? Anyone? I mean, if you're going to be a third wheel, that's the third wheel you want to be a part of, that little cluster of people. And so that's what he is so excited about this. And so they go to that, and then at the dinner, the next request, the king says, okay, so what do you really want, Esther? She goes, I want y'all to come back tomorrow for another meal. Okay. And so as we're kind of working our way through, you got to think about the pride that's going on with Haman at this point. And as everything kind of plays out, one of my favorite parts of this, and by favorite, you'll kind of see it in just a minute, is after all this big invitation and everything's going on, Haman is so excited about it. And so what he does is he calls together, after the first banquet, he calls together everyone, and he's bragging to his wife. By the way, we should time out there, right? Guys, I don't know how many of you guys need to hear this, but if you have to brag to your wife about how important you are, like Haman does here, you need to rethink it, right? That's not a good dating tip, okay? And so anyway, he's bragging to his wife and to his friends about how important he is, but all of this is going on, but there's something going on still with his pride. He just can't let it go. So if you're following along, look in Esther chapter 5, verse 13. But it's going to tell you kind of what the attitude that's going on with him. He is living on top of the world. His pride is just bubbling over. So in Esther chapter 5, verse 13, we see the real danger come up in this pride. After explaining how important he is to his wife and bragging to her, it says, yet all of this is worth nothing to me as so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. It doesn't matter to him at this point. It does not matter. He can have dinner with the king and queen. He can have the next position of power. He can have everything going for him. But as long as Mordecai just stands there as he walks by and doesn't bow down to him, he can't take it. He just cannot take it. And so while he's sitting there with his wife and his friends and they're figuring it out, what they decide to do with this pride that's just overwhelming at this point is we're going to make some poles. We're going to make a pole, 75-foot tall pole, and we're going to impale this Jew, Mordecai, on the pole. That'll take care of your problem, right? Well, we know how this story ends, but at this point, he's probably on top of the world. He should be, at least, on top of the world. And that's when things really pick up. We're going to have to read a little bit here to actually believe what's going on. So we'll pick up in chapter 6 here in just a minute, because what Haman doesn't know is that 5 years before this, Mordecai had actually saved the king's life. There was an assassination attempt on him. You can read at the beginning of Esther. And there was an assassination attempt, and Mordecai was one of the ones who helped expose that. And while he was doing that, it was recorded, it says, in the book of history, but then they never did anything. And so we pick up back in modern day time, 5 years later, that same night, though after the pole has been created that they're going to impale Mordecai on, the pole is ready. And that same night, the king has trouble sleeping. I actually have written in my Bible here, right at the top of chapter 6, I said at this point, God makes things change, not people anymore. God is in control of this situation at this point. The king cannot sleep that night, that same very night. And so what does he do? Look, I don't know what you guys do when you can't sleep. When I can't sleep, I found the solution is to watch NASCAR, IndyCar, something like that, and it puts me to sleep in a minute. They didn't have that then. So the king pulls out the next best thing, the book of history. He can't sleep at night. He tells his people, let's get the book of history. Why can't, wasn't somebody read that to me until I fall asleep, right? No teacher wants to hear that, but, it could work. And so anyway, they're reading through the book of history, and they come upon this point where he reads that Mordecai saved his life. And he asks, did we ever do anything to help him? Did we ever award him anything? I mean, this guy saved my life. Like, no, we didn't do anything. This is where it gets really good. Okay, and so this is where we got to read it to believe it. And so we're going to pick up in Esther chapter 6, verses 4. We're going to read pretty much that whole section just piece by piece here in just a minute. And so remember kind of the context going into this. Pick up in verse 4. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak with the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So he shows up early in the morning. He's ready for this. Verse 5, and the king's young men told him, Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said to him, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, who would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man who the king delights to honor, let robes be brought, which the king has worn, and let the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head the royal crown is set, and let the robes of the horse be handed over. And he goes through this whole process about this whole kingly procession that he wants to go through town, and he wants people there, and everyone's going to call out for him. But the key is in verse 6. He's thinking, who does the king want to award this to more than me? Right? Who would the king want to give all these great things to other than me? He's thinking of himself here. He's thinking all of this is for me. He's thinking I'm so important. I'm going to live out my crazy dream of being the most important person. I'm going to ride on the chariot. I'm going to have the horse. I'm going to have the person in front telling people how great I am. He's going to go through this whole long process because he thinks it's for him. And remember, in the back of his head, he showed up early that morning because he wanted Mordecai killed. He was trying to find permission to do it. And then pick up in verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before them, thus shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. Oh, man. You can imagine how crushed he is. And then verse 12, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate But Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. He's going to complain and whine to his wife again. He's kind of an interesting character here. This whole thing catches him off guard, right? And he goes home and he's whining, but about the time he gets home, you notice as soon as he gets home, it's time for round 2 of the royal party. We can't forget that's coming, right? That's what's going to happen here. And so it's time for them to go back. And this is where things go from bad to worse for him. Because at this point, we don't have to read all the details, but if we continue through the text, we see that at this point, he goes to the dinner. The queen really, he asks the queen, okay, what do you really, really want this time? And the queen says, look, essentially explaining, there's a guy trying to kill me. And the king goes crazy. He's like, who's going to kill my queen? And she points out it's Haman, because he has this decree that he's worked with to create to destroy the Jews. And so things go from bad to worse at this point, because the king is so frustrated that he has to leave the room. He's got to go walk it off a little bit because he's about to go nuts. And while he's out there trying to walk this anger off, Haman's in there begging for his life with the queen. And the king walks in at just the wrong time, because at that point it looks to the king that Haman's trying to assault his wife. And so it's story over for him. And one of the guards, the best part is one of the guards at this point says, I've got an idea. Here's what we could do to this guy. There's a 75-foot pole out there that someone was about to use to hang someone on. Let's drop him on the pole. And so the very pole that he was going to hang Mordecai on is the same one that he's hung on. That story, that's a nutshell, trust me. But that nutshell of a story in Esther, we see pride out of control. We really see it grow and bubble over, where we see Haman thinking he's so important and how no one would want to do anything except to him, and no one would want to give anybody any credit except him. And in the end, he's hung on the very pole that he was trying to kill somebody else on. We see that. But what about this whole idea of being a servant? Let's pick up in Matthew chapter 20. Let's flip over there to our New Testaments and get an example here. Because this first example in Matthew 20 comes from Jesus' own disciples. And it's a little too close to home for a lot of us as we see it. Towards the end of Matthew chapter 20, Jesus, the disciples, everything's kind of coming to an end in the life of Jesus. Of course, the disciples don't really grasp it. Jesus had just told them on the way to Jerusalem for a third time that he's going to be, he's going to be murdered. It's not going to be a pretty sight. And he's just described all of those things, talking about his death. And after this long talk about his crucifixion and resurrection with his closest friends is where we see this request pop up in Matthew chapter 20, beginning in about verse 20. And so they're on their way. Something is not clicking, though. The disciples obviously don't grasp it. They don't really understand what's about to happen. And let's read the text here. Let's see what the request is that they have. So Matthew chapter 20, verse 20 through verse 28. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." And he said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant. It is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be saved, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Did you catch what all went on there? After this whole situation, after this whole thing where Jesus explains, look, my life's about to be over. This is going to be the end of it. I'm going to be crucified, guys. It's a big deal that's going on, and they don't grasp it. It's terrible timing. And this mom comes up with her 2 sons and has a request. Now, the sons of Zebedee, if we were to put together the text in the Gospels, we were to kind of put it together, we would see that this is the mother of James and John. And that if we keep moving through the text and we look at the Gospels together, we realize this is the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who's making this request. This is Jesus' aunt, and Jesus' cousins who are making the request. After he says, look, my life is about to be over, and the request comes in, well, Aunt comes up and says, well, can these guys have your right and your left hand in your kingdom? It's kind of an ugly situation, right? It kind of feels wrong to me to kind of see that, to kind of see somebody trying to use a family position to get that. And it really shows where their hearts are. They're asking, you really think about this, they are asking out of all the people who had ever lived up to this point, and really who would ever live after them, but let's just give them credit up to this point. They're saying out of all the people who have lived up to this point, they deserve to be at the right and left hand of Jesus. That's pretty bold to think about. Think about all the other people, right? They're saying, don't worry about Enoch. They're saying, don't worry about Abraham. Don't worry about Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. We're better than all of them. We deserve to be at your right and left hand. They're saying, don't worry about Moses. Don't worry about Noah. No. We are better. We deserve to have those seats of honor instead. David, the prophets, they're saying, don't worry. We deserve to be at your right and left hand here. In their minds, they deserve those seats of honor more than anyone else. And at this moment, you really have to see it. Well, you can see it. The heart of James and John is the same as the scribes and Pharisees who love those seats of honor at banquets, right? They love those seats of honor and of position in the synagogues as well. Moving as we kind of look through verses 22 and 23, this set of verses reminds us what the brothers are actually asking for here. We see the same thing when we look at this. So if we look at verses 22 and 23, it says, Jesus answered, do you not know what you are asking? Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink? And they said to him, we are able. He said to them, you will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. They want those seats. They think they want that, but they're not willing to pay the price. They want the easy way there. They don't want to go through the things that Jesus had just described to them just a couple of moments before this takes place. They might think they want it, but they really don't. We see the same attitude come out of, I hate to say it, angry preachers, right? We see the same attitude come out of angry elders and deacons and teachers and members when all of a sudden they, for some reason, get upset about something and they think, this is my church. That's a dangerous place to be. You know, whether it's some member who's been there for generations and generations. We have members at our congregation who their families have been there for 110 years since the very beginning. I mean, it was their family's land that the very first building was on. You imagine? Somebody could say that. They could say, this is my church. We see it when elders get upset. We see it when ministers get upset and they storm off claiming that, but they don't want that cup. They don't want to drink that same cup. It's not theirs. Owens Crossroads, not mine. This isn't Ron's. This isn't any of ours because we're not dying for this place. It's not my blood. The name on the sign is the Church of Christ, right? It's his blood. It's his church. We need to all remember that as well and let ourselves get out of the way. And so the cost of what they were asking was higher than they could ever pay. But maybe they couldn't understand it. Maybe they thought something different, but they would actually drink the cup. They would do the same thing. They would be persecuted. They would have their own trials. That would come from this, but not the same exactly as Jesus. Just like Peter would fail, these two would run away when they got scared as well. It's just a small look, though, at all of this. Now, as we keep looking through the text in verse 24, 25, and 26, we see the other 10 start getting upset about this. You can't blame them, right? That somebody else asked about this ahead of time. And so Jesus uses this teachable moment to kind of pull everyone in to talk about it and use that moment to teach. And Jesus reminds them that this is how the world sees power. This is how everyone else treats people, that they have their pharaohs, they have their Herods, they have all their great leaders. He says, this isn't the attitude I want you to have. And he kind of corrects them in that moment. Now, I don't have to tell you as we talk about this, that same attitude of wanting power, that same attitude of wanting a seat of prestige without doing any effort to get there, that's exactly what we deal with. And this attitude that Jesus is teaching about being first, you have to be last to be first, is really a radical teaching that's really not something we're not really used to. It's different for them and it's different for us as well. We like being comfortable. We like being cared for. We like all those other things. We don't want to put in the hard work. We just want the results. But what Jesus is saying is very different. Now let's move to John chapter 13, because this is where we really need to land, at least we need to get to before this is all said and done today. John chapter 13, verses 1 through 11, is where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Let's read this together. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During the supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean. But not every one of you, for he knew who was going to betray him when he said that. Here's the scene we need to think about. If we want to talk about being a servant, this is the moment in the life of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus, where we see that played out the most. Here are the disciples, the 12, the one who's about to betray him, and Jesus knows it at this point, and they're in this upper room, and what's amazing, this amazing object lesson that's about to happen, there's only going to be a handful of people who see it. There's just 13 people in that room total who are going to experience this amazing lesson. The world was locked out of this. Because it was the Passover, the disciples, they'd be sitting on the floor, right? And they'd use their left hand to kind of prop them up as they sat on the floor to kind of give them a little balance there. And they'd leave their right hand available to eat so they can eat, right? That's how they traditionally would do it. But their feet, their dirty, nasty, disgusting feet would be behind them. They would just be back there out of the way. In theory, somebody should be washing these feet. That's part of it. It's part of being a good host. It's part of being a good person in that group. Somebody's got to step up and do it. And they're all sitting there looking at each other. And then Jesus gets up. And I'm sure they noticed, right? The teacher gets up and he takes off his outer garment, and they wondered, what's about to happen? What's Jesus really doing here? But then as he grabbed a towel and put it around his waist, I'm sure they knew what was going on, and they were speechless and shocked at this. They were speechless because they hadn't volunteered. None of them thought it was their place to wash anybody's feet. They thought it wasn't for them. That's a job for somebody else to do. But then Jesus does. They're shocked because they're also guilty of it. They know the same thing. They're shocked because Jesus, the one out of all of them who should not be doing it, is the one who's actually going from person to person. And as he goes around that group of men sitting there for that meal, washing their feet, you can imagine the embarrassment each of them felt. Because they knew good and well they should have been the ones doing it. They knew that Jesus is the one out of all of them who should not be, but they felt they were too good to do it in that moment. They should have volunteered to do it. And then Jesus, like we said, he goes around in this room full of shock and shame, and this object lesson that they all get to see is just amazing. They get to see how no one is too good. The one who should not ever have had to do that was the one who stepped up to do it. Jesus himself was not too good for any act. Let's look at one more place. I think we've got time for it. Let's flip over to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10 is where we encounter the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think it really fits in well with this. We see pride, and we see it in the book of Esther. We see pride as we see it with the disciples fighting for the seat of honor. We see Jesus kind of letting himself take on that role of a servant and taking care of his disciples and saying, look, if nobody else is going to do this, I'm going to take care of it. And then we'll get to see how we can all take this role on and how we should approach things as we look in Luke chapter 10. In Luke chapter 10, in verse 25, we're introduced to the story of the Good Samaritan. It begins with a lawyer. We won't read the whole thing for time's sake, but it begins with a lawyer who stands up in a crowd. Now the lawyer who stood up in the crowd, everyone would have known exactly who he was. He stands up and he's dressed in a very specific way that people would have understood. This is a man of God. He's got decorations on his clothes that would have emphasized the fact this is a man of God's word. This is an expert in the law who stands up and everyone knows who he is, and he asks Jesus a question about how to gain eternal life. It's kind of a simple question, but also one of those really deep questions at the same time. And Jesus, instead of giving him some long, drawn-out answer, he just says, well, what does the law teach? It says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus comes back with the easiest answer to that. He says, well, just do that. You want to know what it takes to have eternal life? Love God, love other people, just live that out. And this lawyer is shocked at that. It's too simple, because if you look in verse 29, it says, but he desiring to justify himself. That's the lawyer. He can't handle how simple that is. And so let's read that from verse 29 on. Desiring to justify himself, the lawyer says to Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion, and he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Verse 36, which of these 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer says, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Think about that. Here we see this parable, this story, right? We see a story, and a guy gets beaten and robbed, and he's on the side of the road, and the first guy who comes up is a priest. And of course, we would all think a priest is the one who's going to help this man out. But he uses a loophole of purity. He doesn't want to ruin his purity, so he uses this loophole to go around the fact and said, I can't mess with this today. I've got other important things to do, and he keeps on going down his way. And then a Levite comes up who would also have been an expert in the law, which probably would have hit kind of close to home for this lawyer. This Levite comes up, and he takes a look at this guy and decides to go around the other side as well. At this point, in my mind, this is just Paddy Flannigan's opinion, by the way, I think that the original audience listening to Jesus that day would have expected just a regular, everyday Jew to come and save the day and be the hero that day. That's not what happens at all. Man, they're shocked, aren't they? When all of a sudden a Samaritan is a hero of a story. I mean, we have to wrap our minds, and it's difficult for us, especially here in the United States, to wrap our minds around how much a Samaritan was hated. There was actually a prayer, a Jewish prayer that was floating around that prayed that Samaritans not be remembered in the resurrection. That is hate. When you can't even, I had a joke. I could tell this because we're in Alabama now, not Tennessee. Once we were doing a church camp, we were putting cabins together, which, by the way, was my first least favorite thing in youth ministry was church camp cabins. And so we were putting cabins together, and we were working on it with the other youth minister of the camp we were doing. And these 2 girls, they just could not handle it when they found out they were in a cabin together. And they were fighting, and they were bickering, and they just could not handle it. They were tearing people apart, making people get on sides. And the youth minister from the other congregation, I love this guy to death. Andy goes, well, I hope you can be with her in heaven. All right, the girl goes, I can't be in a cabin with this. She goes, well, I hope you can be with her in heaven. And you should have just seen their faces stop. That's how much they hated the Samaritans. They didn't even want to see them in heaven. They didn't want them to even have the chance to have that. Now, what we get from this, with our short amount of time left, is the Samaritan, the one no one would have expected, right? We get that, but here's what I want you to get from that. The Samaritan didn't know this guy. It wasn't his cousin. It wasn't someone who's supposed to, and that's where we start to fail when it comes to our service, when I kind of look at that myself. We see some need, and we think, well, that's an important need, but it's not my place to fill that need. We walk up to some problem, and someone needs help, and we say, well, surely their family can help them out, and so we keep moving. Or we walk into a situation where something needs to be done, and we say, well, that's cool, but that's not my job. And so we keep going. Or we walk up and think, well, surely someone's more qualified than me. Or surely someone else gets paid to do this. Or surely, and we just keep making excuses on why it should not be us to serve this way. The same way none of those disciples thought it was their job to wash people's feet. And so we make these excuses. We think, well, surely they have a better friend, their family, their church, somebody else, the government, and we just keep thinking, we keep pushing the problem off because we think it's not our place. And it kills us from being servants because we make up those excuses. We just continue to see that. Look, if there's a need, we need to be there. That man beaten on the side of the road, he wasn't waiting on his family to come by. He didn't need a doctor. He just needed somebody in that moment. And when we are in those same situations where we see a need, we need to just act. We just need to act on it. We need to, if there's something, and you can take it from whether we're here physically in this building or you're out in our community, but if there's a need, you need to act. If there's something that needs to be done, if there's a mess that's been made, if my kids have made a mess in the pews, if they were here tonight, they would. But if my kids have made a mess, clean it up. Don't be afraid. If somebody comes in and they make a mess of things, do it. If there's a problem that needs fixing, a toilet that needs plunging, man, do it. I plunged way too many toilets in youth ministry. Once I had a blister on my hand from church camp of plunging toilets because it's that intensive at church camp. There's so many reasons, though, we try to find these excuses to stay away from serving. And can I make one quick point, though? This is one thing in 11 years of youth ministry, I did notice a trend. It's a tiny soapbox. Thankfully, you only have 4 minutes, so you're good. But there was this idea that anytime something needed to be done, whether it was with a church or with a member or on the grounds or anything, the immediate solution was let the teenagers do it, right? You've probably heard that before. Let the teenagers do it. There's weeds in the beds, let the teenagers pull them. That such and such needs her deck restained, let the teenagers do it. The bus needs washing, let the teenagers do it. Now, it's cool. I had a pretty big youth group. We had a great time. We did a lot of service projects. But it was always the number one answer. Let the teenagers do it. In fact, the one time I had to put my foot down, I don't know if any of y'all have ever been to Concord Road. The building sits on 10 acres. About 5 of those acres are parking lot. And after we had done a new addition, the need at the time was to reseal the church parking lot. And they said, well, let's let the teenagers reseal the parking lot. And I was like, no. That is not, trust me, because you'll end up having to redo it anyway, right? But the key is, we can't just keep pushing it off. As much as we want our teens to learn how to serve and we want our children to learn how to serve and to help other people out, if we're pushing it off on them, we're just still pushing that can down the road and not taking it on ourselves. We've got to do some other things as well. What we need to do, practically speaking, is we need to look closest to us. The places we spend our time now, wherever that happens to be, the people that we are around on a day-to-day basis. And we need to look at those people and those situations and that community, and we need to take our eyes off ourselves and honestly open up not just our eyes but our hearts and see where those needs are that are around us every day, because they are already there. If you want to be a servant like Jesus, you just see what the need is. He saw no one had washed the disciples' feet, and so he said, I'm going to do it myself. It was who he was with at the time. Start with that. Start with the people in this congregation who need help. Start with your coworkers who need help, your physical neighbors, the people who live on the other sides of you. Don't be afraid to help them. If their trash gets knocked down, it feels like that happens like once a month in my neighborhood where somebody's trash can gets hit by a car and their trash is strewn out in the street. Go pick it up. Don't be afraid. Just, it's got to be done. I'm going to do it. You don't need praise and adoration for that. Just do it and get it done with and have it done. It just continues to go. The biggest problem I've noticed specifically in the church is we look at the needs and things that go into making this community of believers function, and it takes a lot, is that in most congregations, and I'm sure it's not that way here, and maybe you can look out, but you can judge for yourself, but in most congregations, the ministers not only minister, teach, and preach, the ministers take on the biblical role of the elders, and then the elders take on the biblical role of the deacons, and the deacons take on the biblical role of the members, and the members just do nothing. They just show up, and they consume. They're consumers. That's a big problem in our society. We've got to look at that and say, what's my role? If I'm just the average member, a sheep, whatever you want to call yourself, if that's me, what's the Bible say my role is, and what should I be doing here? If you're a deacon, Look at your role. We had one of our elders would always say, if you're a deacon, deek, right? Okay, it's not a real word, but serve. Don't be afraid to serve and to help people as well. Elders, I know y'all do your job, but make sure you're doing those God-appointed jobs, and we're going to try to do everything we can, but man, we can't fill in every gap. We can't visit every sick member. We want to, trust me. We really do, but we just can't do it. But all in all, I guess the final point would be, when there's a problem, don't feel like it's somebody else's role to fix it. Don't feel like it's somebody else's position, that you're not qualified, that you're not close enough. If there's something you can do and you're in a situation that you're around, just take care of that in that moment. None of us are too good for that. None of us. Doesn't matter what our jobs are. It doesn't matter what our tax brackets are. It doesn't matter what zip code we live in. None of that. We can all serve each other. We can serve our communities. And by finding those needs and those requirements in the places that we already are, we can begin to start and change something. Let's close out with a prayer. Father, we are so grateful for your Son and the example that he sets through your word and that we're able to study and look at. And Father, I ask you that we don't just look at this, though, that we actually learn from his example and that we act on his example and that we use all these things to glorify you. We don't try to bring that praise to ourselves. Father, help us to just continue to keep our eyes open and our hearts open and to see the needs of those around us and to see the different ways we can serve and we can help. And Father, it all boils down to thinking that we are not too good for anything. We can get our hands dirty, we can get on our hands and feet, and we can do all of those things. And Father, we can do them especially for you and your people and your kingdom. Father, we're so grateful for your Son and the forgiveness through him. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Thank y'all.